In The Silent Gardener, a priceless orchid vanishes from a prestigious estate, threatening to derail a high-profile showcase. All eyes turn to Marcus, a quiet groundskeeper with a mysterious past, as suspicion grows and the search for answers intensifies. But beneath the surface lies a story of love, sacrifice, and a desperate fight for survival. Who really took the orchid, and what secrets are worth risking everything to protect? The greenhouse had always been Marcus's sanctuary. Nestled in the far corner of the sprawling Trenton estate, its glass panes gleamed like a jewel in the pale morning light. Inside, the air was a humid cocoon of earthy scents and vibrant colors, an oasis in a world that rarely felt forgiving. Marcus moved quietly among the rows of plants, his calloused hands steady as he trimmed a wayward vine here, watered a drooping fern there. To the outside world, he was invisible, a man who tended the soil and stayed out of sight. But to Marcus, this world of green and bloom was his salvation. He had been on the estate for nearly 2 years, working tirelessly under the watchful eye of Mr. Trenton, a demanding but fair employer who valued Marcus's meticulous care for his precious botanical collection. Most days were uneventful, filled with the simple rhythm of labor and the quiet companionship of nature. But today, the silence was broken. "Marcus!" The sharp voice of Eleanor, the estate manager, echoed through the greenhouse. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the blinding sun. Marcus turned, his brow furrowing as he saw her tight-lipped expression. "Mr. Trenton wants to see you. Now!" Marcus nodded, wiping his hands on a towel. He followed her up the stone path toward the mansion, his heart sinking with every step. The summons was unusual. Mr. Trenton rarely involved himself with the staff directly. Marcus kept his head low, but his mind raced. Had he done something wrong? Inside the grand study, Mr. Trenton sat behind a massive oak desk, his stern face shadowed by the light streaming in through a wall of windows. On the desk lay an empty glass case. Marcus recognized it immediately. It was where the rare ghost orchid had been displayed just the day before. "Marcus," Mr. Trenton began, his voice low but heavy with accusation. "The orchid is missing." Marcus's chest tightened. He stood motionless, the words hanging in the air like a sentence. "I've already spoken with the others," Mr. Trenton continued, his piercing gaze fixed on Marcus. "You were the last person in the greenhouse last night. What do you have to say for yourself?" I don't know what happened to it," Marcus stammered. His voice cracked under the weight of the moment. "I didn't take it." Mr. Trenton leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You understand how serious this is. That orchid was to be the centerpiece of next week's showcase. Without it—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Eleanor, who stood by the door with her arms crossed, narrowed her eyes. "Marcus has a record, doesn't he?" she said pointedly. The room fell silent. Marcus felt the heat rise in his face. He had worked so hard to leave that part of his life behind, but it seemed the shadows of his past were never far away. "Yes," Mr. Trenton said finally, "but I'd hoped we were past that." "I didn't take it," Marcus repeated, his voice firmer now. "I swear." But his words felt hollow even to him, because deep in his pocket, he felt the crumpled piece of paper he hadn't yet discarded, a prescription slip with Anna's name scrawled at the top. Anna. Her image flashed in his mind, her frail body leaning against the kitchen counter, her eyes sunken but still defiant. The orchid's pollen had been her last hope, the experimental treatment a sliver of a chance. And so, in the dead of night, Marcus had taken it, not for greed, not for malice, but for love. "Dismissed," Mr. Trenton said finally. "But don't leave the estate." Marcus nodded stiffly and turned to leave, his mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. As he walked back to the greenhouse, the weight of his secret pressed heavier on his chest. He had always known the cost of love could be steep, but now it seemed the price might be everything. The distant chime of the estate's clock tower marked the hour, each toll a reminder of time slipping away. Marcus had to decide. Should he confess and risk losing everything, or keep his secret, and hope Anna's life would be enough to justify the theft? Behind him, Eleanor watched his retreating figure with narrowed eyes. She didn't trust him. not for a moment, and she was determined to find the truth, no matter the cost. The greenhouse felt colder that evening, as though the warmth had been sucked out along with Marcus's peace of mind. He worked mechanically, trimming leaves and misting flowers with water, but his thoughts spiraled endlessly. He could almost hear Anna's voice in his head. "We'll find another way." But there hadn't been another way. The doctors had been blunt. The experimental treatment required a natural compound found only in the rare ghost orchid. It wasn't as if Marcus had marched in and stolen it without a second thought. He had agonized over the decision for weeks, the image of Anna's gaunt frame haunting him every time he hesitated. "Marcus?" Eleanor's voice startled him out of his thoughts. She stood at the greenhouse door, arms crossed, her sharp eyes cutting through the dim light. "I need to check your quarters." Marcus froze. His quarters? "It's protocol," she added quickly, though her tone was anything but routine. "We need to ensure nothing was misplaced." He clenched his jaw. Eleanor's suspicion wasn't unexpected, but the thought of her rummaging through his tiny room, so close to discovering the truth, sent a chill through him. "Of course," he said evenly, forcing his hands to remain steady as he placed his tools down. "I have nothing to hide." Eleanor's lips twitched, almost into a smirk, as though she didn't believe him for a second. The small room Marcus called home was sparsely furnished. A narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a desk cluttered with gardening manuals and a faded photograph of Anna. Eleanor moved methodically, opening drawers and inspecting every corner with the precision of a hawk. Marcus stood by the doorway, his heart hammering with each object she examined. When she reached the corner shelf, her hand hesitated near a small, sealed jar filled with dried petals. Marcus tensed, knowing it was a decoy, leftovers from a less valuable orchid he'd cultivated himself. "What's this?" she asked, holding the jar up to the light. "Potpourri," Marcus replied smoothly. "For Anna." Eleanor's brows lifted slightly, but she placed the jar back without comment. Marcus released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. After another few minutes of fruitless searching, Eleanor turned to face him. "I didn't find anything," she admitted, though her tone lacked satisfaction. "Like I said," Marcus replied quietly, "I didn't take it." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, as though trying to peel back the layers of his carefully constructed facade. Finally, she nodded and left the room without another word. But Marcus knew this wasn't over. Eleanor's doubt lingered in the air, and it was only a matter of time before she dug deeper. That night, Marcus sat by the single window in his room, staring out at the greenhouse illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. In his hand, he held the prescription slip once again, its edges frayed from being folded and unfolded too many times. The orchid sat in a makeshift terrarium in his kitchen, its delicate white petals still pristine. Marcus had only taken one dose of the pollen so far, carefully extracting it with tweezers and mixing it into the tincture Anna needed. Her condition had improved, just slightly, but it was enough to make him feel the theft had been justified. Still, guilt gnawed at him. He couldn't ignore the look of betrayal in Mr. Trenton's eyes, or the way Eleanor seemed ready to pounce at the slightest misstep. He had always been careful to stay invisible, to work quietly and avoid attention. Now the fragile life he'd built was at risk of shattering. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Marcus frowned. It was late, far past the time anyone should be wandering the estate. He opened the door to find Beth, the youngest of the house staff, standing nervously in the hallway. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked, stepping aside to let her in. Beth hesitated before pulling a small notebook from her apron pocket. "I thought you should see this. Eleanor's been writing things down." Marcus took the notebook, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages. It was filled with meticulous notes, dates, and times, everything from when he entered the greenhouse to when he left. There were even observations about his mood and behavior. "She's been watching you," Beth explained, her voice barely audible. "I heard her talking to Mr. Trenton earlier. She's convinced you took the orchid." Marcus clenched his fists. He had known Eleanor didn't trust him, but this level of scrutiny felt like a violation. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Beth looked down, twisting the edge of her apron. "You've always been kind to me," she said softly. "I don't think you did it." But Eleanor, she won't stop until she finds something. Marcus nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Thank you, he said quietly. As Beth slipped back into the shadows, Marcus stared at the notebook in his hands. Eleanor's obsession with proving his guilt was a threat he couldn't ignore. He had to protect himself and Anna. But how? In the distance, the greenhouse lights flickered, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the estate. Marcus's mind raced with possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. The truth would come out eventually. The question was, would it destroy him when it did? The sun rose over the Trenton estate, casting golden light across the dew-drenched gardens. But for Marcus, the new day brought no solace. Sleep had eluded him, replaced by the gnawing realization that time was running out. Eleanor's scrutiny would only intensify, and Anna's fragile recovery hinged on a stolen flower he could never openly return. He spent the morning in the greenhouse, his hands moving with practiced precision as he repotted a series of orchids. The work, usually meditative, now felt like a hollow routine. His mind churned with plan, none of them good. Should he flee? Confess? Try to reason with Mr. Trenton? A shadow fell across the greenhouse floor. Marcus looked up to find Beth standing in the doorway again, her face pale. She's looking through the greenhouse logs now, Beth said quickly, her voice tinged with panic. Eleanor, she's trying to pin it on you. Marcus set down the orchid he was holding and straightened. What did she say? Beth wrung her hands. She's telling Mr. Trenton that your notes don't add up. She said you've been acting strange, spending more time here late at night. Marcus exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. She's not wrong, he admitted. I've been taking extra care of the plants. Beth hesitated. You have to stop her, Marcus. She's not just going to accuse you, she's going to find proof or make it up if she has to. Marcus's jaw tightened. I'll handle it, he said, though he wasn't sure how. By midday, Marcus's opportunity came. He spotted Eleanor heading toward the greenhouse, her ever-present clipboard in hand. She didn't notice him trailing behind her as she entered, her sharp eyes scanning the rows of plants like a predator searching for prey. Looking for something? Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. Eleanor turned, startled, but quickly recovering her composure. Just doing my job, she replied coolly. Seems like your job's taken a particular interest in me, Marcus said, stepping closer. Care to tell me why? Eleanor's lips curved into a tight smile. Why wouldn't I? A rare orchid goes missing, and the man with a criminal past suddenly has a reason to need money. It's not exactly a mystery, Marcus. Marcus felt his fists clench involuntarily. I told Mr. Trenton. I didn't take it. Eleanor's smile didn't waver. Then you won't mind if I keep looking. Honest men have nothing to hide. She brushed past him, her gaze flicking toward a cluster of rare blooms. Marcus knew the stolen orchid wasn't here, but her persistence made his blood run cold. You're wasting your time, he said, his voice sharper now. Eleanor paused, turning to face him fully. Maybe. But until that flower turns up, you'll always be the prime suspect. I wonder how long Mr. Trenton's patience will last. Her words were a warning, a challenge, and a declaration all at once. Marcus watched her leave, his chest heaving with the effort of holding himself together. He couldn't let her win, not when so much was at stake. That evening, Marcus sat across from Anna in their cramped apartment. She was stronger today, her cheeks carrying a faint flush of color that hadn't been there in weeks. It was a small victory, but it filled Marcus with a bittersweet mix of relief and dread. You're quiet, Anna said softly, her voice still tinged with the rasp of illness. Marcus looked up, meeting her eyes. Just tired, he lied. Anna studied him, her gaze unyielding. You've been more than tired lately, she said. What's going on? He hesitated. Anna didn't know the full truth. He hadn't told her where the orchid had come from, only that it was necessary. He didn't want her to carry the weight of his actions. It's nothing, he said finally. Just work. Anna's brow furrowed, but she didn't press further. Instead, she reached across the table and took his hand. Whatever it is, we'll get through it, she said firmly. Her words hit him like a blow. She trusted him, believed in him. And yet, here he was, dragging her into a mess she didn't even know existed. The next morning, Marcus found a small envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a single note written in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting. "Meet me in the greenhouse tonight. Midnight. Come alone." Marcus stared at the note, his heart pounding. Was this a trap? A chance to explain himself? Or something worse? He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. Whatever Eleanor had planned, he couldn't avoid it. When midnight came, the greenhouse was cloaked in darkness, save for the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through its glass walls. Marcus entered cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the dirt floor. Eleanor was already there, standing near the center of the room with her arms crossed. "You came," she said, her voice low. "You asked," Marcus replied, keeping his distance. "What do you want?" Eleanor took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "I want the truth, Marcus. I want to know where the orchid is." "I told you. I don't know," Marcus said evenly, though his pulse quickened. Eleanor tilted her head, her expression hardening. "You're lying," she said. "I've seen the way you've been acting. Nervous, avoiding questions. You think I'm stupid?" Marcus said nothing, his silence stretching into an unspoken confession. Eleanor took another step forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Do you know what happens if Mr. Trenton decides you're guilty? You'll be finished. Not just here, but everywhere. No one will hire you. You'll lose everything." Her words struck like a dagger. Marcus knew she wasn't wrong, but before he could respond, Eleanor's next words stopped him cold. "I'll give you one chance," she said, her tone softening. "Tell me the truth now, and I'll make sure Mr. Trenton goes easy on you." Marcus stared at her, his mind racing. Was this a genuine offer or just another manipulation? Could he trust her? Or was it already too late? Marcus held Eleanor's gaze, the tension between them as thick as the humidity in the greenhouse. Her offer lingered in the air, tantalizing yet barbed with doubt. Confessing would unravel everything, his fragile life at the estate, his chance to help Anna recover, but refusing could make her suspicion boil over into certainty. "You don't understand," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "This isn't about money or greed." "Then tell me what it's about," Eleanor shot back. "Help me understand, because right now, all I see is a man trying to cover his tracks." Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. He had spent so long guarding the truth, but now, under Eleanor's unrelenting scrutiny, the weight of his secret felt unbearable. He glanced around the greenhouse at the plants he had nurtured with care, and then back at her. "Do you promise you'll take this to Mr. Trenton fairly?" he asked, his voice edged with desperation. "That you won't twist it into something it's not?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "I'm not here to ruin you, Marcus. I just want the truth." For a moment, he considered lying again, spinning some half-truth that might buy him more time. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't work. Eleanor was relentless. "It's not here," he said finally. Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "The orchid," Marcus said, his voice heavy. "It's not in the greenhouse. I took it." Eleanor's breath caught, and for the first time, her composure faltered. You're admitting it?" Marcus nodded, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his confession. "I took it, but not for the reasons you think." Eleanor stared at him, her expression a mix of shock and curiosity. "Then why? What could possibly justify stealing something so valuable?" He hesitated, the words sticking in his throat, but there was no turning back now. "It's for Anna," he said quietly. "She's sick. The orchid's pollen. It's part of an experimental treatment. Without it," he trailed off, the unspoken end of the sentence hanging in the air. Eleanor's face softened slightly, but her eyes remained sharp. "And you didn't think to ask Mr. Trenton for help? You just decided to take it?" Marcus's voice hardened. "Do you think he would have said yes? He doesn't care about people like us, people with nothing. He cares about his showcase, his reputation. Anna didn't have time to wait for him to decide whether her life was worth an orchid." For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. She looked away, her gaze drifting to the plants around them, as if searching for clarity among the blooms. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she said finally, her voice quieter now. "If Mr. Trenton finds out, you're finished, and that's if you're lucky." Marcus nodded grimly. "I know. but I'd do it again if it meant saving her. Eleanor sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. This is a mess, Marcus. A giant, complicated mess. The next morning, Marcus expected the worst. He went about his tasks with a heavy heart, his every movement shadowed by the certainty that Eleanor would report him to Mr. Trenton. But by midday, nothing had happened. No summons, no accusations, no police at the gates. Instead, Eleanor appeared at the greenhouse, her expression unreadable. "Come with me," she said simply. Marcus followed her down the estate's winding paths, his mind racing. When they reached her small office in the staff quarters, she closed the door behind them and turned to face him. "I thought about what you said," she began, her tone neutral. "And as much as I don't agree with how you handled this, I can't deny your reasons." Marcus's chest tightened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I haven't told Mr. Trenton. Yet." He exhaled sharply, relief washing over him. But before he could speak, Eleanor raised a hand. "Don't thank me," she said sternly. "This doesn't mean you're off the hook. That orchid is still missing, and eventually someone's going to notice. If we don't figure out a solution soon, this whole thing is going to blow up." Marcus nodded, his gratitude tempered by the reality of her words. "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this," he said. Eleanor gave him a long, appraising look. "Good, because I'm not sticking my neck out for you unless you're willing to meet me halfway." The days that followed were a blur of tense conversations and careful planning. Eleanor insisted on visiting Anna to see the situation for herself, and though Marcus was reluctant, he eventually agreed. When they arrived at the apartment, Anna greeted Eleanor with a weak smile, her pale face lighting up at the sight of Marcus. "You must be Eleanor," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Marcus told me about you." Eleanor glanced at Marcus, then back at Anna. "He told me about you too," she said evenly. "And about the orchid." Anna's smile faded and she looked down at her hands. "It wasn't his fault," she said quickly. "I told him not to." "It doesn't matter whose fault it is," Eleanor interrupted gently. "What matters is what we do now." Marcus watched as the two women spoke, his heart aching with a mix of hope and dread. Eleanor's hard exterior seemed to soften as Anna explained her condition and the desperate measures they had taken. By the time they left, Eleanor's expression was pensive. "I can't promise this will work," she told Marcus as they walked back to the estate, "but I'll do what I can to help you." That evening, Marcus returned to the greenhouse with a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. But as he knelt by a row of orchids, carefully inspecting their leaves, a noise behind him made him freeze. He turned to find Mr. Trenton standing in the doorway, his expression cold. "We need to talk," Mr. Trenton said, his voice like steel. The weight of Mr. Trenton's gaze bore down on Marcus like a storm cloud threatening to break. Marcus rose slowly from where he had been kneeling among the orchids, wiping his hands on his apron to steady his trembling fingers. "Yes, sir," he said, keeping his voice calm despite the pounding in his chest. Mr. Trenton stepped further into the greenhouse, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel floor. The man had an air of authority that seemed to fill the space, shrinking Marcus's carefully cultivated sanctuary into something small and suffocating. "Do you know why I'm here?" Mr. Trenton asked, his tone even but sharp as a blade. Marcus swallowed hard. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. Yet he couldn't bring himself to lie again, not when the truth was clawing its way to the surface. "I think I do," Marcus replied carefully. Mr. Trenton's eyes narrowed. "The orchid," he said, each syllable a pointed accusation. "It's been missing for days, and I've just learned there are irregularities in the logs. Care to explain?" Marcus hesitated, the weight of his secret pressing against his resolve. Before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "I can explain." Both men turned to see Eleanor standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Eleanor," Mr. Trenton said, his tone sharp, "what are you doing here?" She stepped inside, her clipboard tucked under one arm. "I've been looking into the orchid's disappearance," she said smoothly, "and I believe there's an explanation that doesn't involve Marcus." Marcus's heart leapt, though he kept his face neutral. Mr. Trenton raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Eleanor nodded. "The orchid wasn't stolen, sir. It was moved, temporarily for preservation." I have reason to believe it was showing early signs of fungal rot. If it had been left in the greenhouse, it could have endangered the entire collection." Mr. Trenton's expression darkened. "And you didn't think to inform me of this sooner?" "It was an oversight," Eleanor admitted, her tone steady. "I wanted to confirm my suspicions before raising an alarm. Marcus was assisting me with the process, which is why the logs might appear unusual." The lie was so seamless, so convincing, that even Marcus felt a flicker of doubt. He glanced at Eleanor, his gratitude mingled with awe at her quick thinking. Mr. Trenton sighed, his frustration evident. "You should have brought this to my attention immediately," he said. "Where is the orchid now?" "It's safe," Eleanor replied. "I can retrieve it for the showcase." "You'd better," Mr. Trenton said sternly. "This entire estate's reputation depends on that orchid. I expect it back in pristine condition by the end of the week." "Yes, sir," Eleanor said, her voice calm. With a final, lingering look at Marcus, Mr. Trenton turned and left the greenhouse, his footsteps echoing on the gravel path outside. As soon as he was out of earshot, Marcus exhaled deeply, the tension in his body releasing like a coiled spring. "Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to. Save it," she interrupted, holding up a hand. "We're not in the clear yet. That orchid needs to be back here before Mr. Trenton gets suspicious again." Marcus nodded. "I'll bring it back tonight." Eleanor hesitated. "Are you sure Anna will be okay without it?" "She's stronger now," Marcus said quietly, "and I'll figure out another way to help her." Eleanor studied him for a moment, her hard exterior cracking just enough to reveal a glimmer of compassion. "You're lucky she has you," she said softly. "But you need to be smarter about how you protect her." Marcus nodded, her words cutting deep. "Thank you," he said. Eleanor gave a small nod and turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "Don't make me regret this, Marcus," she said, before disappearing into the night. That evening, Marcus retrieved the orchid from the terrarium in his apartment, its delicate white petals glowing softly in the dim light. Anna watched from the couch, her face a mix of relief and sorrow. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice trembling. "We can figure out something else." Marcus shook his head. "This is the only way to keep our lives from falling apart. You've come so far. I won't let this ruin everything." He carefully placed the orchid in a padded container and kissed Anna's forehead. "I'll be back soon," he said. The greenhouse was dark and quiet when Marcus returned, the air thick with the scent of soil and blossoms. He placed the orchid back in its display case, adjusting it with meticulous care until it looked as though it had never been disturbed. For a moment, he stood there, staring at the flower that had caused so much turmoil. It was beautiful, fragile, and impossibly rare, a symbol of both his desperation and his love. Footsteps behind him broke the silence. He turned to see Beth standing in the doorway, her wide eyes filled with alarm. "Marcus!" she whispered urgently. "Something's happened. Mr. Trenton knows the orchid was gone. He just doesn't know who to blame yet." Marcus's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Beth stepped closer, her voice trembling. "He's called for the police. They'll be here tomorrow." The words struck Marcus like a physical blow. Time was up. The hours leading up to dawn were suffocating, each tick of the clock bringing Marcus closer to an inevitable reckoning. The orchid was back in its rightful place, but the damage had already been done. If the police arrived and began investigating, his secret and his reasons for taking the flower would be laid bare. Marcus paced his small apartment, the tension in his body coiling tighter with every step. Anna, sitting on the couch with a blanket draped over her frail frame, watched him with worried eyes. "What are we going to do?" she asked softly. Marcus stopped and turned to her, his hands balled into fists. "I don't know," he admitted. "If they find out everything we've worked for, it's over." Anna reached out and took his hand, her touch light but grounding. "Then let me help," she said. "You've helped enough," Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. "This is my mess to clean up." "No," Anna said firmly. "It's our life, and if you think I'm going to sit here while you face this alone, you don't know me at all." Her defiance brought a flicker of warmth to his chest, but the fear quickly smothered it. "Anna, you're not strong enough. I'm strong enough to stand by you," she interrupted. "Let me talk to Mr. Trenton. He deserves to know why you did this. Marcus shook his head. You don't understand what he's like. He won't care about the why. All he'll see is a betrayal. Maybe, Anna said, her gaze unwavering. But we don't have any other options, do we? By mid-morning, the tension across the estate was palpable. Marcus worked in the greenhouse, his hands trembling as he trimmed a row of orchids. Every sound, the creak of a door, the crunch of gravel, sent a jolt of panic through him. When the police arrived, their presence was impossible to ignore. Two uniformed officers stepped out of a car parked near the main house, their calm professionalism a stark contrast to the storm raging inside Marcus. Eleanor found him first, her expression tight with urgency. They're here, she said quietly. I know, Marcus replied, his voice hollow. Eleanor glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. The orchid's back where it belongs. They might not find anything. And if they do? Marcus asked, the question hanging between them like a noose. Eleanor didn't answer. The officers began their investigation methodically, speaking with the staff and examining the greenhouse and surrounding areas. Marcus avoided their gaze, keeping his focus on his work, as if his life weren't crumbling around him. But his reprieve didn't last. Marcus, one of the officers called, their voice firm but not unkind. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Yes, we need to ask you a few questions, the officer said. Marcus nodded, wiping his hands on his apron to hide their shaking. Of course. As they led him toward the main house, Marcus caught a glimpse of Anna standing near the staff quarters, her face pale but determined. She gave him a small nod, and he felt a flicker of strength in her silent support. In the study, Mr. Trenton sat behind his massive desk, his stern face a mask of controlled anger. The officers stood on either side of the room, their presence a reminder of the stakes. Marcus, Mr. Trenton began, his voice low and measured. The officers have reason to believe someone on this estate is responsible for the orchid's disappearance. You were the last person in the greenhouse the night it went missing. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Marcus opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the door to the study burst open. Wait! Anna's voice cut through the room like a blade. She stepped inside, leaning heavily on the door frame but holding her head high. Who is this? Mr. Trenton demanded, his eyes narrowing. She's with me, Marcus said quickly, moving to her side. Anna, you shouldn't be here. No, Anna said firmly, her gaze locking onto Mr. Trenton. You need to hear this. The room fell silent as she stepped forward, her movements slow but purposeful. Marcus didn't take the orchid for himself, she began, her voice steadied despite the strain in her body. He took it for me. Mr. Trenton's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. What are you talking about? Anna explained everything. The illness, the experimental treatment, the desperate hope that the orchid's pollen might save her. She spoke with a quiet intensity that filled the room, her words weaving a story of love, sacrifice, and survival. When she finished, the silence was deafening. Mr. Trenton leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. So, you're telling me he stole one of my most valuable orchids to save your life? Yes, Anna said simply, and I'd do the same for him. Marcus felt his chest tighten, the weight of her words filling him with both pride and fear. Mr. Trenton stared at the couple for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. This is unprecedented, he said, his tone more weary than angry. I don't condone theft, but I can't ignore the reasons behind it. He turned to the officers. There's no need for further investigation. The matter is resolved. The officers exchanged glances but nodded, stepping out of the room without further comment. Marcus felt a rush of relief, but it was tempered by Mr. Trenton's piercing gaze. You're fired, Marcus, he said bluntly. I can't have someone I can't trust working here. Marcus nodded, his heart sinking. He had known this was coming. But, Mr. Trenton continued, I won't press charges, and I suggest you use this second chance wisely. Thank you, Marcus said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Mr. Trenton waved them off, his attention already returning to the papers on his desk. As Marcus and Anna left the estate hand in hand, the weight of their ordeal began to lift. They had lost their place on the estate, but they had each other. And for the first time in weeks, They could finally breathe. The road away from the Trenton estate stretched before Marcus and Anna, winding through fields and wooded patches that seemed to hold a quiet promise of something better. Marcus drove the old pickup truck in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as his mind churned. Beside him, Anna rested against the window, her exhaustion evident, but her presence a steadying force. The air between them was heavy, not with anger or regret, but with uncertainty. They had escaped the immediate threat of the law and Mr. Trenton's wrath, but they now faced a new question. What comes next? "I'm sorry," Marcus said at last, his voice breaking the stillness. Anna turned her head to look at him, her brow furrowing. "Why are you apologizing?" "For everything," Marcus said, his grip tightening on the wheel. "For putting us in this mess, for losing my job, for—" "Stop," Anna interrupted gently but firmly. She reached over and placed a hand on his arm. "You did what you had to do, and I'm still here because of it. That's all that matters." Her words eased the tension in his chest, but the weight of his guilt lingered. "But what are we supposed to do now? I don't have a job, and we're barely scraping by as it is." Anna's gaze softened. "We'll figure it out," she said. "We always do." They arrived back at their small apartment just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Marcus helped Anna inside, her steps slower than usual but steadier than they had been in weeks. The familiar surroundings of their home felt like a reprieve, a small bubble of normalcy amid the chaos of the past days. Marcus busied himself with preparing a simple dinner, the rhythmic motions of chopping and stirring grounding him. As they ate in the soft glow of the kitchen light, Anna spoke up. "You know, you've always talked about wanting to start your own greenhouse." Marcus looked at her, surprised. "That was just a dream," he said with a shrug. "Something I thought about when things got hard. So why not make it real?" Anna asked, her eyes shining with quiet determination. Marcus shook his head. "We don't have the money. And even if we did, I don't know where we'd start." Anna smiled faintly. "We start small. We use what we have, and we build from there." Her optimism felt like a lifeline, a spark in the darkness that had been consuming him. "You really think we could do it?" he asked, his voice tinged with both hope and doubt. Anna nodded. "I know we can. You're the best gardener I've ever known, Marcus. And if you can grow life in someone as stubborn as me, you can grow it anywhere." Her words brought a rare smile to his face, and for the first time in days, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. Over the next few weeks, Marcus and Anna began laying the groundwork for their new dream. They converted the small patch of land behind their apartment into a makeshift garden, filling it with the plants Marcus had salvaged from his time at the Trenton estate. Their neighbors took notice, curious about the vibrant blooms and fresh herbs that began to sprout seemingly overnight. Some even stopped by to ask questions or offer encouragement, their interest a reminder that they weren't as alone as they had feared. One afternoon, an elderly woman named Mrs. Lopez shuffled over with her granddaughter in tow. She admired the rows of flowers and vegetables, her wrinkled face lighting up with delight. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice warm. "You're really bringing life to this place." Marcus smiled, his hands caked with dirt. "Thank you. We're just getting started." Mrs. Lopez nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Well, if you ever need help, let me know. I don't have much, but I've got plenty of stories to keep you entertained while you work." Her offer brought laughter to both Marcus and Anna, and as Mrs. Lopez walked away, Anna leaned over to Marcus. "See? It's already working." As the weeks turned into months, their little garden grew into something bigger. Word spread about the couple who could make anything bloom, and soon, locals were bringing over empty pots and withered plants, hoping Marcus could work his magic. Anna, though still recovering, threw herself into the project as well. She researched new techniques, experimented with medicinal herbs, and shared her findings with Marcus late into the night. Their partnership, once tested by desperation and secrecy, now flourished in a shared purpose. But the shadow of their past lingered. One evening, as Marcus closed up the garden for the day, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the property. It was Eleanor. Marcus straightened, his heart pounding. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Eleanor approached slowly, her expression unreadable. "I heard about your little operation," she said, glancing at the rows of plants. "Looks like you've been busy." Marcus nodded warily. "What do you want, Eleanor?" She sighed, folding her arms. "I wanted to see how you were doing, and to give you this." She handed him a small envelope. Marcus hesitated before opening it, his eyes widening as he read the contents. It was a check, a substantial one, with Mr. Trenton's name signed at the bottom. "What is this?" Marcus asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "It's a grant," Eleanor said simply, "from Mr. Trenton. He didn't want you working for him anymore, but he recognizes talent when he sees it. Consider it an investment in your future." Marcus stared at the check, his mind reeling. Why would he do this? Eleanor's lips curved into a small smile. Because Anna made him see something he hadn't seen in a long time, what it means to care about something other than money. She turned to leave, pausing at the edge of the garden. "Don't waste it, Marcus, and don't make me regret sticking my neck out for you." As she disappeared into the twilight, Marcus stood frozen, the check trembling in his hand. That night, he showed the check to Anna, her eyes filling with tears of joy and disbelief. "This is it," she said softly. "This is our chance." Marcus nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and determination. For the first time in years, the future felt like something they could shape together. The greenhouse stood at the edge of town, a structure of glass and steel that gleamed like a beacon under the soft morning sun. Inside, rows of plants flourished, their vibrant greens and vivid blossoms a testament to love, resilience, and second chances. Marcus stood at the center, his hands dusted with soil, surveying the space that had become the heart of their new life. It had been nearly a year since the ordeal with the orchid, and the journey to this moment had been anything but easy. The grant from Mr. Trenton had been both a blessing and a responsibility, pushing Marcus and Anna to build something that honored the trust and risk behind it. Together, they had poured every ounce of energy and skill into creating the Bloomhouse Greenery, a greenhouse that wasn't just a business, but a haven for the community. As Marcus watered a row of herbs, he heard the soft jingle of the bell above the entrance. He turned to see Anna stepping inside, her movements lighter, her cheeks carrying the healthy flush of someone who had defied impossible odds. "How's it looking?" she asked, her eyes sparkling as she took in the lush greenery. "Better than ever," Marcus replied, a smile spreading across his face. Anna walked over to him, slipping her arm through his. "Mrs. Lopez just stopped by," she said. "She wants us to grow lavender for her soap business, and the Rodriguez kids are asking if they can volunteer here after school." Marcus chuckled. "We're going to need a bigger space if this keeps up." Anna leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice soft. "That's a good problem to have." The Bloomhouse Greenery had become more than Marcus and Anna had ever dreamed. What started as a modest operation had grown into a thriving hub where neighbors gathered, students learned about sustainable gardening, and customers sought out the rare and medicinal plants that Marcus had a talent for cultivating. But the greenhouse wasn't just about plants. It was about people, about the lives they touched and the connections they built. Eleanor stopped by every few weeks, always with a thinly veiled excuse to check on their progress. Though her visits were brief and businesslike, Marcus could sense a quiet pride in her sharp eyes. "You're making the most of it," she said during one visit, gesturing to the thriving greenery. "We couldn't have done it without you," Marcus replied sincerely. Eleanor waved off the comment, but her faint smile lingered. "Just keep proving me right," she said before leaving. One afternoon, as Marcus worked in the greenhouse, he noticed a familiar car pull into the gravel driveway. His breath caught as Mr. Trenton stepped out, his imposing figure silhouetted against the sunlight. Marcus wiped his hands on his apron and stepped outside to meet him, his heart pounding. "Mr. Trenton," he said, his voice steady but guarded. "What brings you here?" Mr. Trenton surveyed the greenhouse, his expression unreadable. "I was in the area," he said, though the excuse felt thin. He stepped closer, his gaze sweeping over the rows of plants visible through the glass walls. "You've done well for yourself," he said finally. "Thank you," Marcus replied, unsure of what else to say. Mr. Trenton's gaze softened just slightly. "I didn't think you'd make it this far," he admitted, but I'm glad to see I was wrong. The unexpected compliment caught Marcus off guard. That means a lot, sir, he said. Mr. Trenton nodded, his eyes lingering on a nearby cluster of orchids. Take care of them, he said gruffly, before turning to leave. As Marcus watched him drive away, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. That evening, Marcus and Anna sat outside the greenhouse, the golden light of sunset bathing the world in warmth. Do you think we're finally free of the past? Anna asked, her voice thoughtful. Marcus reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. I think the past will always be part of us, he said. But it doesn't define us anymore. This, he gestured to the greenhouse, the garden, and the horizon. This is who we are now. Anna smiled, her eyes glistening. It's beautiful. They sat in comfortable silence, the hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves filling the air. The road that had brought them here had been rough, marked by sacrifice, pain, and hard choices. But it had also been a road paved with love, resilience, and hope. And as the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Marcus knew that they had not just survived, they had grown, like the flowers they nurtured, reaching for the light. Thank you for listening, The Silent Gardener. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to HeroKind Stories and leave a comment below. Tell us what you would have done in Marcus's place. Share this tale of love, sacrifice, and second chances with friends who believe in the power of hope and redemption. Together, let's keep these stories blooming.